I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. My colleague joins me from my affiliate WMAL in the nation's capital, the capital of the United States of America. Once upon a time, that capital launched a fleet about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. It was eventually called the Great White Fleet. It was Teddy Roosevelt's idea to assert American authority across the planet. The fleet sailed to Asia. It sailed into Yokohama. It sailed to China. It sailed throughout the Sea of Japan as an expression of American ambition to enter into the world stage. Eventually that happened. It didn't happen until after the First War, and not really profoundly until the Second War. Here we are 100 years later, and another fleet, an armada in the Sea of Japan. This one, however, Russian warships and Chinese warships, the People's Liberation Army Navy. Gordon Chang has led me to believe that the Chinese working with the Russians is a warning sign of games afoot. Gordon, is that right? There's a game afoot in Asia. These are not natural friends.
Yeah, they're not natural friends, and really what the Chinese are doing are trying to intimidate the Japanese, because these naval exercises, which are the largest in the history of the People's Republic with a foreign power, are very close to Japan's Senkaku Islands, which the Chinese believe are really their own. So this is a question of sovereignty over 6 barren outcroppings in the East China Sea, and it's very important to both nations, Japan and China.
We're joined by Scott Harold, an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation, writing in The Diplomat recently in these last months about the, may I use a French word badly, rapprochement between Russia, between Moscow and Beijing, between the boss of Russia, that's Mr. Putin, and the boss of China, that's the Standing Committee led by Xi Jinping. Scott, a very good evening to you. Once upon a time, it was the Great White Fleet in the Sea of Japan. Now it's this hybrid. These put together, slapped together, bought from many places, Chinese warships with the Russian warships paid for by the energy superpower of Moscow. Is this a sign of trouble ahead, or is this an expression of ready to join the world stage, ready to trade again? Good evening to you, Scott.
Good evening to you, John, and to you, Gordon. Well, John, I think, this is a sign of ambition. It is, as Gordon notes correctly, something that is going to carry implications for Japan, for the United States. But I also think that it's worth bearing in mind that Gordon's point, which is correct, that this is the largest naval exercise China has ever carried out with a foreign navy, is in part true because China's history of doing naval exercises with foreign militaries is so short and so of such limited size and scope. So this is really a new area. The PLA Navy has traditionally been a very weak service in China, certainly nothing on par with the Japanese Navy, the Russian Navy, or the U.S. Navy, and therefore, while it's accurate to say it's the largest, it's also would be accurate to point out that it has historically not had much experience, and so this is a bit of a first step for them to, or an early step at least for them to move into this arena.
Gordon?
Scott, at the beginning of the Cold War, we had the Soviets and the Chinese on one side and us and the Western Europe on the other. Towards the end of the Cold War, starting from 1972 onwards, we had Nixon's trip to China, and we have the United States and China in sort of an effective alliance, not a formal one, but certainly working side by side, and they were pretty much arrayed against the Soviets. Today, are we going to have Moscow and Beijing in another informal alliance, but this time against us? Or are these two nations, China and Russia, so at odds that they'll never be able to come to terms with each other? Which is it?
It's actually, Gordon, I like the options you've given me, but I'd like to add a third. I think that it's in some ways a case that China and Russia will be at times arrayed against the United States or the West or international human rights and values and democracy. But these are very, very opportunistic and very, very nationalistic regimes. They deeply mistrust each other. They know that they are competing for a lot of the same space in the international game in the Central Asia, for example. And China is a very, very resource-hungry power, as you know very well. and the Russian Far East has enormous resources and almost no population or ability to defend them. So the Russians are very, very anxious about China's rise. Part of this is an effort to work together with China to forestall or put off any prospect that China might eye those resources hungrily. And of course, the Chinese side likes to leverage any voices that can magnify its own in stating that democracy is not a universal value, human rights are not necessarily applicable to countries at certain levels of development, and that the West should mind its own business. And that's a message that, of course, Mr. Putin finds very heartening.
Since the Second War, Scott, the Sea of Japan was an American sea. Is that over? Is it done? Are they saying we can't contest anymore?
The interesting thing there, John, is that, as I understand it, some of the exercises that the Russians and the Chinese are just wrapped up today were occurring, at least at times, in areas that would fall within the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone of Japan. And as both of you very well know, China has made the claim repeatedly that the United States cannot carry out aerial or maritime intelligence gathering within 200 nautical miles of China's shores. The fact that China is now doing that in relative proximity to Japan in contravention of its own stated policy would seem to suggest either that China might be realizing that its previous position will limit its ability to extend its reach off its own shores, or that they will be very opportunistic and even would be willing to be called hypocritical if it's in their national interest. I don't know that that means that we've lost access to that body of water. It is an international body of water. While it may have been characterized as an American sea, it was really an international body of water that all vessels and all vessels of all nations could transit. But I definitely think that as the PLA Navy has grown more capable, it's unlikely that any uncontested use of that water would be possible ever again.
Less than a minute. Go ahead, Gordon.
Scott, the Chinese are arrogant and the Russians are prickly. Do you or do you not agree with an assessment like that?
Let me say this. I think I know what analysts who make that comment are aiming at, but these are countries we're always going to have to find some way, a modus vivendi with, no matter whether we like China or Russia or not. They are always going to be there, and so we have to find some way to work with them. And when we cannot work with them, when they do take positions that are anathema to our interests, we have to be prepared to stand up and say no, and to work very closely with our allies to support our values and our interests, whether the Chinese and the Russians like them or not. It can be very challenging, but simply saying I don't like you or you're too prickly, I don't know that that will get us very far in international diplomacy or in our international relations.
Scott
Harold will have to work with them.
Scott Harold, an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com at WMAL in Washington. 100 years ago, it was the Great White Fleet. Now it's the Great Red Fleet. I'm John Batchelor.